Hello, I'm Xiaoling, and this is the Technomancer. So, what is the Technomancer? It's an RPG developed by the studio by the name of Spiders, the same team that made Mars Logs and Bound by Flame. I see many folks are trying to compare this to The Witcher 3, but I'll say this, it's not an open world game, so for me at least, I felt it was more similar to a game like Knights of the Old Republic, or to an extent Mass Effect, with combat that quite closely resembles that from Jade Empire. So for those of you who have played either of those games, you'll probably find something to enjoy here. But before we get into the game, let's take a look at the options. So under the video options, you would have everything you'd expect to find. You have windowed, borderless windowed and windowed mode. You have a variety of different resolutions. VSync, you have interface, SSAA, you've got shadows, SSAO, anti-aliasing, FX, AA and TAA. The shadows do go up to ultra, as you can see. You've got particles, which goes up to high, texture quality from low all the way through to ultra, anisotropic filtering all the way to 16 times, dynamic resolution, you have this bar that changes everything here, and of course the field of view. Now unfortunately they don't actually tell you what the field of view is with a number. It would have been nice, I think, with that, but this is a third-person game, so it makes a little bit less of a difference, and more noticeably governs the distance of the camera from your character. Now you're probably wondering why some of these settings are not on their maximum, especially dynamic resolution. And the reason is that when I started playing the game, initially for my review, I was playing on my SLI 970s, but I had actually put them up for sale, and they were both sold during the time I was doing the review. So I had to revert back to my old GTX 670, and as a result had to turn down some of these detailed settings, and dynamic resolution was one of the biggest factors influencing the frame rate. But for the most part, the frame rate was between 45 to 60, and there wasn't too much of an impact to the visual fidelity. Obviously, when I was running on my SLI 970s, the scaling was relatively good for the game, and the frame rate at maximum possible detail settings at 1080p was almost a constant 60, with the exception of certain areas where there seemed to be hiccups. I'm not sure if this is an issue with the review build. It is possible that a patch could sort these issues out. So if you do notice that some of the footage doesn't seem to be as good looking or smooth as other parts, that is the reason why. But all in all, it was still very playable, and I don't feel, even as fussy as I am about frame rate, that it hindered my enjoyment of the game in any significant way. Otherwise, moving on to the audio settings, everything you'd expect: master, volume, effects, music and dialogue. It's nice to see that they have separate sliders for everything. We have a number of different game settings as well, so you can disable the tutorials, and you can have your damage displays and all that kind of thing. If you want to, you can also change the difficulty when you start the game. And of course, your control settings if you're going to use a controller. And there's a bunch of different key bindings if you plan to use the mouse and keyboard. And there are secondary buttons for these, which is nice indeed. The one thing I do want to talk about is the brightness. They say that this should be barely visible, but when that's barely visible, the game is incredibly dark. So I honestly wouldn't recommend that at all, and the majority of the game, most locations are going to be pretty dark already, so I'd recommend having this a little bit up so you can actually see what's going on. Those are pretty much the options you're going to find for the Technomancer, so I think without further ado, let's get into the game itself. So the game offers around a 20-hour campaign, and if you choose to do the side quests as well, which there are plenty I might add, you'll get an additional 15 hours or so out of the game according to the press information. Now, I've been playing the game for about 25 hours, making my way through the game. I haven't been rushing, but I've been doing a fair amount of the story quests, and I've done a lot of the side quests as well. So by my reckoning, I'm probably quite close to the end, but there are still more things to do. So you'll play a character by the name of Zachariah, who is a soldier for the Abundance Corporation. He's also part of a group called the Technomancers, which is a secretive group of people who have an innate ability to use the power of electricity. They have high respect and are considered to be very powerful. And on your journey, you're going to be learning more about the origin of these Technomancers, as well as dealing with a number of different factions that are in the game, all who have a different agenda. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the story, since I believe in a game like this, the experience of the story is part of the fun. And what I will say though is that it remains interesting for the most part, but with that said, it's not the most original story I've ever seen, but it does the job of moving the narrative forward. So when you start the game, you get to create your character, and this part is kind of limited. If you're used to many of the other RPGs where you have this abundance of selections, you don't get to choose your gender. There are only very few customizations to be made here. You choose your hairstyle and color, your eye color, and your skin color, and that's pretty much it. I think it would have been nice to have a larger selection of options to choose from, especially since in an RPG you get quite attached to your character. Now, you also don't get to choose the name of your character since he already has one, and you're basically referred to by that name throughout the dialogue and the story in the game as Zachariah or Mr. Mancer. Now, I think that they could easily have just referred to your character as a Mancer and allowed you to choose a male or female character as well as your name. However, I suppose it doesn't really affect the experience in this game too much. Also in Technomancer, you don't get to choose your class, or at least you don't choose your class when you start the game, but you can essentially switch between the different classes on the fly in combat. So there's the warrior, there's a rogue, there's a guardian, which are all considered fighting styles. But then there's also a class called the Technomancer, which is basically a skill tree that increases the damage of your lightning attacks and things like that. The Technomancer class is not a style in and of itself, so it's usually used in combination with whatever style it is that you've chosen to use, whether it's warrior, rogue, or guardian. There are 4 buttons in combat that you're going to be using. Your left button is your primary attack, space is like a secondary attack, and control is your third attack. Now both control and space will do different things depending on what style you're using. And finally, your right mouse button is going to dodge. So the warrior uses a two-handed staff, which is a great AoE weapon. It has a good reach. The rogue uses a dagger and a pistol and is able to poison enemies, and is also great for maintaining a distance. And finally, the guardian is very much a defensive style character, so this allows you to block attacks, but you don't have a lot of range since you're going to be attacking with the mace. Now all of these styles have their uses depending on what enemies you are up against. The thing, however, is that as you level up, you'll be putting points into the different trees, which will obviously make those styles more powerful, they'll do more damage, and they'll also unlock special moves, which can be quite devastating to the enemies once they're off cooldown. And so it makes sense to obviously use the primary style that you've put points into, since it's going to be more effective than the ones that you haven't put points into. In my case, I chose to put the majority of my points into the staff and then Technomancer as my secondary, so then I could use them in conjunction without having to change to any of the other styles. There were a few times though that I did switch styles, but it really wasn't all that often. So you can also lock onto the enemies during the combat, but honestly I found this to be more cumbersome than helpful, especially when fighting multiple enemies. Not being locked on and having the freedom to look around and dodge anywhere on the screen, I found to be far more effective than being confined to dodging relative to the guy that you're locked onto. And also, once you get used to the system of dodging and going in for attack, you start to get a feel for it, pretty much like Batman Arkham Asylum, and then you'll have no issues hitting all the enemies that you are going for. But all in all, the combat remains for the most part quite enjoyable. As a martial arts instructor, I really appreciate the combat animations. I think they've done a great job here, and it feels impactful, it looks great, it feels good. But there is a downside in that the combat is not that varied. Also, quite early in the story, you're going to unlock your first companions who fall into the various different styles that we've just spoken about. You can kit them out with gear, and you can also set up their behaviors in combat. All of these companions have backstory which you can follow, which involves some questing, which is going to increase your relationship with any given companion. And if they're on your team and you have a good relationship with them, they will incur you some bonuses as well, which is nice. I'm sure some of you are wondering if you can romance any of your companions, and the answer is yes, and I'll leave it at that. So after every combat encounter, after doing every quest, you're going to get XP, and of course that leads me to the leveling system. So once you level up, you're going to be putting skill points into your class trees, so your warrior, your guardian, your rogue, your technomancer. Each tree has a variety of different skills in them, but unfortunately the majority of them are passive skills that just give you small bonuses like increasing damage or increasing crit chance and that kind of thing. There are some bigger passive abilities that can be upgraded within themselves, and there are also some active abilities that can be upgraded within themselves. So each of these special skills have 2 upgrades, and you can only choose one of them, so you'll have to decide what kind of build you're going for. Also, every 4 levels you're going to be able to increase your base attributes like strength, agility, power and constitution. To use better gear or better weapons for a particular class, you're going to have to level these particular stats. Also, as you level up, you're going to be unlocking different talents. They fall into 6 categories: charisma, science, crafting, stealth, trap / lockpicking and exploration. Of course, some of these are self-explanatory, and again some of them are more useful than others. Like for example, in the second stage of the charisma upgrade, not only are you going to get even more bonuses to your dialogue choices, but it increases the damage of your companions by 20%. And then the third level increases your charisma even more and increases the health of your companions by 20%, which is actually quite significant. Whereas on the other hand, you have something like exploration, which increases the amount of loot you're going to find, which personally I found far less useful because, you already find so much loot in the game as it is. So there's a crafting system in the game as well, although it's quite shallow if I have to be entirely honest. You can craft consumables like health potions, traps, and fluid potions, and that's pretty much it. Or you can craft upgrades for various weapons or various pieces of armor. You don't actually get to craft weapons or armor in themselves. So each item has a number of different slots depending on what level it is and what quality it is. And these upgrade slots can take upgrades that will increase your critical chance, the damage, or the chance of disruption. For example, if it's the staff, every weapon has different effects, so they'll have slightly different upgrades that are available for them. Or in the case of armor, there's going to be damage resistances and resistance to being disrupted and that kind of thing. There are a number of different effects, and the better the version of the upgrades, the larger the bonus is going to be. So also in games such as KOTOR and Mass Effect, all the dialogue in the Technomancer is voiced. And honestly, the voice acting isn't half bad. Some of it was actually quite decent. Obviously, depending on the characters you're talking to, some are better than others, of course.
What's little secret shared against a strong friendship, after all?
I would be honored to have you among my friends, Colonel. But alas, I don't know what secret you're alluding to. I'm sorry.
A pity indeed.
There are dialogue choices that you're going to have to make that are going to affect people's opinions of you, as well as affect the different outcomes in different situations. You basically get karma points for doing good things, as well as points toward a particular faction, depending on the choices you've made, which will impact certain options and events later in the story. So there is a world map in the game as well that you will eventually have access to, that's going to allow you to travel between the different hub zones, as well as a variety of different smaller mission areas. I'm not going to show that here in the video, since all of that falls into spoiler territory, but needless to say that each hub contains many side quests and sub-areas that you'll get to explore. There are a variety of enemies in the game that you're going to fight. The majority of them are going to be humanoid type of enemies, and some of the encounters can actually be pretty challenging. There are a number of different difficulties as well when you start the game, so if you do want a more or less challenging playthrough, you can change those. But I'm going to say that there are a few things I need to talk about because the game isn't without its issues. If you've chosen to play the game with the recommended gamma settings, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's going to be a very dark experience. And you do have sort of a clip torch on your guy, but having the torch on in some cases does very little to help the darkness level. So you can climb up and drop down ledges, and obviously this is not a problem in itself, but the problem comes in once you've climbed up a ledge. You have to wait for your guy to walk forward, and then he stands there for 2 seconds before you can actually control him again. And the same problem happens once you've dropped off a ledge. You have to wait for the animation to finish. He's going to walk forward a bit, and then you can only control him after 1 or 2 seconds. This is really odd indeed, and I do hope that they can fix this with a patch. Another issue is the map. Now, there is a main map by pressing M, but that's not the most convenient to do while you're running between locations. Unfortunately, your mini-map doesn't show you that much info since it's quite small, so you have to press Alt to display the overhead map. Now, there's no way to have waypoint markers, so you're going to have to hold on Alt while you're moving around the map in order to see where you're going properly. And because you want to run a little bit faster, you're going to be holding Shift as well. So in order to get around quickly and know where you're going, you're going to have to hold Shift and you're going to have to hold Alt all the time while you are moving around. It's really not so convenient. I think that a toggle for both of these functions would have been nice. Now, of course, you can set up macros and toggle switches on your keyboard or mouse software, but you really shouldn't have to. My other annoyance is the vendors. All the vendors are displayed on the map by little dollar signs. The problem is each vendor sells a specific good and doesn't sell the other goods. So the weapons guy, the armor guy, and the consumables guy, you can't go to one person to get all these things. You'll have to go to different vendors. And unfortunately on the map, all the vendors are displayed by the same icon, so you have no idea. You should be able to just open your map and it should show you this vendor sells weapons, this vendor sells armor, and so on and so forth. And I suppose my final complaint I have is the backtracking. Throughout the story, you're going to be revisiting some of the areas several times, each of the hubs, But every time you leave a specific hub and you go back, all the mobs are going to have respawned. So you're going to end up having to fight some of the same groups of mobs over and over and over, which is obviously going to get a little bit tedious after a while. But honestly, outside of these complaints, there really wasn't anything that struck me as glaringly bad or broken. I maybe had 1 or 2 crashes in my time with the game, which is not bad for 25 hours of play. I never played Mars Logs, and I never played Bound by Flame. I understand that they got mediocre reviews, but to be honest, I didn't have any expectations when starting the Technomancer, so I honestly had no idea what to expect, and I'll say that I've actually been very pleasantly surprised by the game. It feels like a KOTOR game, it fights like a Jade Empire game, which to me are both good points in my book. Yes, the game looks kind of dated, and yes, the combat and RPG mechanics aren't particularly deep or varied, but they are enjoyable, and for the most part, I had a great deal of fun while playing the Technomancer. I think there will be some degree of replayability with the game, since you can choose to play, or specialize at least, in a different fighting style, which will make a somewhat different combat experience. But more importantly, you can make different decisions in many of the encounters in the game, which in turn will have different outcomes and lead to a different ending, no doubt. Is it as good as KOTOR? No. But I think it's definitely worth checking out. There is a lot of content here and a good many hours of fun. It's a B-grade game, but it's a good B-grade game, and I'd recommend it. Spiders is not a AAA developer, but this I believe is their most expensive game so far, as I understand it. And it's certainly a step in the right direction, and I do look forward to what they are going to do next. Otherwise, that wraps up my look at Technomancer. This is probably the longest video I've made so far, but there was a lot that I felt that I wanted to talk about. But I think it's time for me to get back to Mars. I think the mutants need my help. You can pick the game up on Steam for $45 or your regional equivalent. If you get it before the game releases tomorrow, you'll get a 15% discount, I believe. Otherwise, if you guys have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video and would like to see more content, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share, since it helps the channel grow. Thanks very much for watching. I've been Xiaoling. Until next time.
301 Marshall 170, 24 Angels 9 Expected approach time 33, approach button 7.